Hello, my name is Jonathan Lyon and I'm a Program Manager in Microsoft's Identity Engineering team, which is responsible for Azure Active Directory, B2C and Microsoft accounts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the value proposition of the Microsoft Identity Platform and why, as developers and ISVs, you should consider integrating your applications with Azure Active Directory. Before we get into why we believe ISVs and developers should develop on our identity platform, I want to start by taking a step back and providing context to why identity is so important in today's world. In the past, it was a simpler time. An employee or user had a single device accessing a few apps that were on-premise, within the office, and within that network perimeter. But the world is a much more complicated place now. There's a host of apps, devices and services that people are using every day, and they are collaborating among more people, be it with co-workers, customers or partners. And more, the data is being stored in the cloud, and users are accessing these apps and data on multiple devices, either on their own personal device or a device given to them by an employee. And those applications, they will sit with a number of vendors. This ends up being a complicated matrix of possible scenarios that we need to allow our users to do, and of course protect against as well. The one thing that can bind and secure these disparate items together is cloud identity. Like Microsoft has with Azure Active Directory, we see identity as the control plane, and as Gartner suggests that by 2021, identity as a service will be the majority access model. So identity has become the hub to manage this chaos. And as organizations and their employees are moving to the cloud, the security strategy needs to start with a strong protected single identity at the center of the business. Having a strong identity and access strategy is crucial for balancing security and productivity. Identity is the new control plane. It safeguards your customers' assets, your assets, both on-premise and in the cloud. Firstly, I'd also like to clear up a misnomer. Azure Active Directory is not just for Microsoft products. Sure, it might have seemed like it started that way, with Azure Active Directory being a requirement for Office 365. But this is an identity platform that anyone can leverage, whether you fully embrace the cloud, on-premise or in a hybrid deployment. Here is just a small sample of partners not just utilising the platform, but adding value to applications, hardware and devices, building on top of it to enrich Azure Active Directory's capabilities. Let's start with looking at the different varieties of Azure Active Directory. We have Microsoft Azure Active Directory, which is intended for ISVs that want to provide software to many enterprise customers. This allows them to develop apps intended for other Azure Active Directory tenants. So anybody that uses Azure Active Directory can then leverage single sign-on with your application. And that doesn't just need to be Microsoft. As I mentioned, that could be Google, that could be people that are still on premise. It could be a real mixture of environments. Customers can also share your application from their tenant using external identities and external users. One of the things with Azure Active Directory is, as an ISV, you won't have a customer identity store. All the identities are stored in the customer's directories and tenants, and they will just pass you an authentication token. One of the great things with Azure Active Directory is it provides a way for you to get user data via automatic user provisioning. So if you do need that user data for licensing or whatever means, you can actually get that sent to you via Azure Active Directory using automatic provisioning. Customers can easily onboard your application via a gallery, so they can find and add your application to their tenant. But the key thing to note here is the customer manages the identity. They manage the security, the compliance. So if they want things like MFA on, they turn that on within their tenant for their users. With B2C, this is intended for inviting customers to your apps, whether that's individuals, an institution, organizational customers into an Azure Active Directory. So here you do get an identity store. With that identity store, you can have local B2C identities which you manage. They will sign in using an email address and a password which you store. And typically you would set up identity providers, whether that's social ones such as Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or even work identities such as Azure Active Directory. You could add those as identity providers. But one of the things that's different here is security, policy and compliance is managed by the application. You can also manage the application's branding, including the sign-in and sign-up process, and control that sort of experience for the users. So the big difference is Azure Active Directory, you allow Azure Active Directory tenants to add your application and onboard. Obviously, you can do authorization, so you can make sure they've bought licenses, etc. And with B2C, you're actually getting customers to sign up to your application. So you define which identity providers you want to be able to consume your application. So let's take a look at an example app to the use cases for both Azure AD and B2C. Here we have Woodgrove Groceries, an online supermarket. We have three distinct types of users. Firstly, we have individual customers. These are the general public who want to order their groceries for delivery to their home. Then we have business customers. Now these could be a mix of independent cafes or restaurants, all the way up to a large restaurant chain that need to order produce for their locations. And then finally, we have business partners. These are the businesses that supply the supermarket. Let's look at the individual customer. B2C provides a number of user flows, including sign up, sign in, as well as self-service functions such as password reset and edit my profile. So here the user can choose to sign in or create an account if they have never shopped here before. With B2C, we can provide the user with the option to use a social identity provider. On the screen we've got both Microsoft accounts and Google accounts, but this could have been Facebook, Twitter, many more. You define which identity providers you want to offer for your application. In this example, they can also log in with a local B2C identity, which Woodgrove Groceries would manage. This is the one where it says email address and password. You also can notice that you can fully customize the look of the login experience. You can tailor it to exactly the look and feel of your application. When we look at the business customers and partners, these two user groups would want to use their corporate credentials to access the site. No one wants to remember another username and password. They will want single sign-on, and most likely their IT department will want them to use security capabilities like multi-factor authentication. With B2C, as I mentioned earlier, you can add Azure Active Directory tenants as identity providers, allowing business customers to sign into your application with their corporate credentials. As you can see in the screenshots, the login experience is branded to the organization logging in. This is deliberate as it shows the user that they are authenticating against their company's Azure AD tenant. So it's a security feature. The B2C tenant redirects to the organization, and that organization can show their branding so the user knows it's their corporate login that they should be using. Nobody wants to access something that looks completely different and ask for their work username and password. This is the same look your customers will experience if you were using Azure Active Directory. Instead of fully branding the login experience, they will be redirected to their tenants and organization branding. A new capability we announced recently at Build is Azure Active Directory External Identities. Imagine a scenario where you have a customer of your app. They will want their staff to authenticate using their corporate credentials, just like we spoke about. However, they use contractors or seasonal staff who do not have corporate credentials, perhaps because they do not require the productivity tools like Office 365. However, they do need access to your application. External identities allows your customer to either invite these contractors or have them request access to your application using their own identity, including social identity providers such as Facebook. If they request access, you can also have workflow in place to approve the access. You can even limit their access based on time. Now, this may seem an unusual scenario. So let's run through a real example where we've seen a customer use Facebook to log into a company app. So let's go back to the Woodgrove Groceries example. During busy holiday seasons, they hire a large number of students to cope with the increased business during that period, which also coincides with the college and school holidays. These students are now employees, and they need to access a shift rota or booking system to say what shifts they can and cannot do. This will only be for a few weeks at a time, and it would take nearly as long for an identity to be created and managed for that user by the in-house identity team. So let them authenticate using their Facebook. Let them log in using a social identity provider they already have. They can get up and running and using the application straight away. So now we've covered the platform at a high level, let's look at why you should use our platform. I'm going to cover the 5 main benefits in this session of using Microsoft Identity. The first is reduce sign-in friction for both you as an ISV and for your customers. By no longer managing identities and authentication within your application, you will save time and can focus on your core product. Lower the cost of development, no more building infrastructure to store usernames and passwords. Your users will also have a better experience. Allowing users to use their preferred identity to sign into applications is not only great from a user experience, but IT security within your customers will also be requiring that. Enhanced security. How many of you that have apps where you store usernames and passwords today have had your customers ask for MFA? How many of your customers ask about security and make demands on how your app is secured and how they can access your app securely? Using Azure Active Directory, you and your customers will be able to leverage a suite of security capabilities, which I'll cover later on in this session. Leveraging the Microsoft Cloud. I'm also going to cover how you can use our Microsoft Graph API to integrate and leverage Office 365 capabilities within your applications, enriching them and also providing a better integrated story with other applications your users will be using. And then comply with IT. This is about reassuring your customers' IT and security teams that your app is safe and secure. And of course, we come to integration. At the end of this session, I will talk about the wealth of resources that we provide that makes integration into Azure Active Directory easy. This is the one salesy slide, I promise. And I won't go through each of these numbers, but it's safe to say we have a lot of customers, which means there is a very good chance that your customers are already using Azure AD. So let me put some of these numbers, and they're impressive numbers, into a bit of context. Everyone that uses Office 365 has Azure Active Directory. Everyone that uses Azure has Azure Active Directory. So what if your customers don't use either of those? We have large numbers of Amazon Web Services customers using Azure AD as their identity provider. Same goes for Google. We have large numbers of Google's G Suite users using Azure Active Directory. And these numbers are growing all the time. And you may have seen some of the recent news where in the UK, 1.2 million staff across the NHS will gain access to our productivity and collaboration tools within Microsoft 365. If you're building a healthcare app, in a very short period of time, it's a safe bet that they will all have an Azure AD login. And of course, Office 365 is free for education. So if you're building education applications, there's a very good chance they have Azure Active Directory. And then the final point on this slide really is quite a key one, is Azure Active Directory is free to everyone. So if you've got a customer that doesn't meet any of those scenarios I talked about, maybe they're still on-prem, they've got a small business server in the corner of the room, they can install Azure AD Connect, synchronize their identities into Azure AD, and leverage that and leverage single sign-on to your application. And we don't charge for the basic tier of Azure Active Directory, so they can use that straight away. So let's get into a bit more detail. So why single sign-on? Well, there's some really key advantages here. One identity. Your customers will love you for this one. Providing one identity, and importantly, their identity, to access your application in the same way they access all their other applications and on-premise infrastructure. Signing in with a known Azure AD or Office 365 account, as the customers may perceive it, really does improve that experience for your users. It also provides enhanced security. It's based on a trusted platform, a platform they're already embracing and using on a daily basis. For you, it's removing the need to build and maintain an authentication solution. You no longer have to worry about that. All you need to do is cover authorization and let people access your application. You can delegate user and access management to the customer. You can then integrate into M365 using the Microsoft Graph, so you can start leveraging those capabilities. And also, it makes your app easy to find for your customers when they come to onboard your application, and for their staff when they actually want to start using it. So once you've integrated your application, it can be discovered across several surface areas when you integrate with Azure AD. IT admins can discover your application within the Azure portal. This is using our Azure AD App Gallery. So this helps IT admins easily deploy your application across the company for specific users and groups. For ISVs, your application can be eligible to be listed in that gallery, allowing it to be easily found and onboarded. And your application is then also eligible to be discovered within the Office 365 App Launcher, the Office 365 App Gallery, within Microsoft Search on Office.com, users' My Apps portals. So when IT provisions your application across an organization, users can easily discover and access your application just in the same way they would Word, Excel, Outlook. So what is the Azure AD App Gallery? Well, it's a store where an ISV can publish their application for integration with Azure AD. The gallery delivers a trusted location for customers to consent access to your application, and the gallery enables ISVs to allow their customers to use their Azure AD account to log in to your solution. Now, the IT pro versus developer battle is now over. As a developer, you will no longer need to get access to that customer's environment to set up your application. The IT pro will get a note or a memo from the business saying that we've bought this app and we need to get it set up for single sign-on, or the business might ask the IT pro to find an application that does a certain function. Either way, that IT pro can find your app in the gallery and run through these simple steps. In fact, there is only one required step: turn on single sign-on. The others are optional, but I guarantee your customers will want to use them. They can assign user and groups that they want to access the application. They can enable the security controls they require using conditional access. For example, turning on MFA when using the application outside of the office. They can also turn on self-service, allowing their users to request access to the application and enable workflow to govern that. And finally, provisioning. I'll talk about this in more detail later on, but this allows them to send identity information to your application as and when it changes if your application needs user data, perhaps for licensing. The IT pro could log into your app and then see the users there defined, so they could then assign licenses or roles within your application. We can also take that one step further with one-click single sign-on. So we're working with a number of partners now where we're actually getting the scenario where the wizard base is even simpler for turning on that single sign-on experience. So let's run through a quick example of that now with DocuSign. So I can automatically configure sign-on by just going through these steps. Click Setup on DocuSign, which brings me to the DocuSign admin portal. I click Yes. On the DocuSign portal, in the Setup Single Sign-On window, I just click Yes. This lets Azure AD auto-populate the fields for me. All I have to do now is click OK to save the changes. It really is that easy. And then that's it. Click OK, and we're now back to the Azure portal. And this is something we're getting more and more ISVs onboarded with to even streamline that process for the IT pro. Okay, so I did lie. There's one more sales slide, which is this one. A few years ago, Azure Active Directory was a service mainly used for Office 365 and Azure because they were down the hall, and that's when we built Azure AD. But today, it's used with thousands of cloud SaaS applications from different clouds and hundreds of thousands of line of business and web applications. In fact, over 1.4 million apps are integrated with Azure Active Directory. These are apps Microsoft did not write. They include every major cloud app you can think of. Here are some of those, such as ServiceNow, Google Apps, Workday, SuccessFactors, to name just a few. And every month we're adding more and more applications into our gallery. And in fact, our gallery more than doubled in the last calendar year. And so how do you provide single sign-on for your application? Well, we use industry standards. So in order to provide single sign-on with Azure Active Directory, you need to use OAuth, OpenID, or SAML. So we recommend if you're building a brand new application, you go down the OpenID Connect and OAuth route. If it's an existing application, then especially if you're already using it, SAML is fully supported. And with B2C, you can build your own customer sign-in and sign-up experiences as well. So you can not only provide single sign-on, you can tailor that sign-in experience. Once you have your app working with Azure Active Directory using OAuth or SAML, you can apply for the application to be added to the Azure AD App Gallery. Other than using OAuth or SAML, one other requirement we have is that your application needs to be SaaS and multi-tenanted. The URL is here to register your application, but feel free to contact myself, my team, or your Microsoft One commercial partner contact to request access to the portal. It's also worth mentioning that B2C does not use the app gallery. Instead of customers connecting their Azure AD tenant to your app, you would add them as an identity provider. With B2C, you're building an app and defining which identity providers you want to use your app. With Azure AD, it's the opposite way. You're building an app that customers can connect to so they can onboard and use it. One of the key differences with B2C is providing a great sign-on experience around its extensibility. You can customize the user journey. So with Azure AD B2C, sign up and sign in policies allow you to control the behavior by configuring settings such as account types that consumers use, attributes that are collected from the consumer during sign up, multi-factor authentication usage, and the look and feel of the registration and authentication pages. So you may want to collect additional data that isn't in the authentication packet, such as their hometown location, or maybe the school they went to, depending on what sort of data you want within your application. You can also design the user experience. This is designed to offer you flexibility and control. These customization capabilities include white labeling features that allow you to design the entire user experience to blend seamlessly with your web and mobile applications. So let's talk about security. If you manage your customer's identity, then you're responsible to an extent security, especially if you also host the application. And we see a lot of ISVs getting requests from their customers around demands and requests for security capabilities like MFA. So why build or buy in those capabilities for your application? The answer is you shouldn't. When you integrate and build with our identity platform, you're able to protect your application and users more effectively by allowing customers to leverage capabilities within their Azure AD. So what do we mean by this? Well, when your customers sign in with their Azure AD account, they can get the security benefits and access controls they know and already use. They can extend their Azure AD security benefits to your application. So instead of adding code to your app that enables MFA, conditional access, or other advanced security features, our identity platform can provide these to your end customers on your behalf. It can help your application then comply with IT policies because you don't have to implement them. Your customer implements the policies onto your application. And when we talk to enterprise customers and enterprise IT, they want and need applications that comply with their policies. And there's three big areas that I want to highlight on how we can help protect your application and users when they're signing in using their Azure Active Directory account. Secure authentication to ensure the right user are allowed to access your application. Conditional access to reach a zero trust model. This helps automate access control decisions for the application. And then identity protection, which helps safeguard the identities the customer's using to access the application. The first way we can secure your application with Azure AD is with secure authentication methods. To start with, they can use MFA using the Authenticator app on Android and iOS, an SMS message or a voice call. And MFA is a big step because MFA can prevent 99% of identity attacks by having that second factor in. And in fact, MFA with Azure Active Directory is free of charge. So we're so keen that customers use MFA, we're including that in there. Secondly, they can use passwordless authentication. So passwords are your biggest vulnerability, partly because they are the target of most attacks we see today. 81% of all attacks were the result of weak or compromised credentials. But there's hope. Your customers can utilize passwordless technologies such as Windows Hello, part of Windows 10, using biometrics such as facial recognition or fingerprint. They can also use the Authenticator app to do passwordless authentication, or using a FIDO2 security key, like the YubiKey in the picture here. These technologies allow your users to authenticate without entering credentials. Thirdly, we also continue to innovate around cloud-powered solutions like Azure AD password protection to help you secure those user credentials. It may come as no surprise that users reuse passwords, or worse, set standard passwords all the time. Bad news is, hackers know this too, and according to our data, exploit this vulnerability all the time. With Azure AD password protection, we help enterprise identities in two ways. Banning common passwords that we see all the time at our end, and also giving them the ability to define custom banned password lists. And the second is Smart Lockout, which gives enterprises the ability to define policies around how many times a wrong password can be entered before locking the user out. These capabilities are really key. Imagine a scenario where a user has used the same password for your application. So they've got the same username and password as their corporate credentials within your application because it's easier to remember. In that scenario, if your application was to be compromised and those credentials taken away from it, the attacker then has the same credentials to access that customer's tenant. So by your application being compromised, the customer's tenant is now compromised. But by putting in these capabilities and moving the identity store away from you and using your customer's identity, moves that problem away from you. Conditional access is our way to help customers implement a zero trust strategy. Conditional access is an intelligent policy that allows you to define conditions for how users authenticate and gain access to apps and data. So your customers can use their conditional access to implement a trust nothing, verify everything approach. So they can now set up using the following criteria around users, the who, device and client app, the how, and location, the where. And based on those criteria, they can make a decision on how they would access your application, the what. So let's look at a quick example. When your customer uses your app in the office on a domain joined device, that's fine. When they use a domain joined device at home, they want to trigger MFA to make sure the user is who they say they are before they access your application. When a user uses a personal device in a coffee shop on the free Wi-Fi, they would want to perhaps block access altogether to your application. So using conditional access, your customers can define that and put those controls in for your application. Additionally, we also feed in data from our intelligent security graph. This brings security signals like user behavior, location, state of device, application being accessed, and the risk score for user and sign-in are analysed. Using machine learning, the signal is analysed and an appropriate policy is enforced, such as allow, limit, block, password reset, or request additional verification. For example, if we see stolen credentials available on the internet and we make a match with a user logging in, we can trigger that as a high-risk session and require that user to reset their password. Azure AD Conditional Access enables you to take into account for every sign-in the user, location, device, app, risk and data before allowing access. Not all the parameters are equal all the time, but you definitely want the flexibility to have this level of control, and your customers are using and implementing this today. And the key thing here is they can use all these controls on your application once you've integrated it into Azure Active Directory. Finally, identity protection is the third way that we can help protect your application and users. With Azure AD Identity Protection, we help safeguard identities with machine learning algorithms and heuristics that detect anomalies and suspicious incidents. We observe trillions of signals and risk events and apply AI and human expertise to detect any suspicious activity and are able to send these activities to address certain threats. So the key message I want to cover here is by simply allowing your end users to authenticate with Azure Active Directory to your application, you can extend these security benefits for your application, protecting the users without having to do any additional code. So you won't need to make any changes to your application other than using Azure AD as an identity provider. Yet all these capabilities are now for your application. And it's well worth, when you're talking to your customers, telling them that they can leverage these capabilities with your application. So now we've got secure authentication in place using your customer's identity, let's look at adding some capabilities to your application. This brings us to the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph API allows your application to integrate and leverage capabilities and data within the customer's Microsoft 365 or Office 365 environment. This can be anything as simple as asking who a user's manager is, or accessing or placing data into a user's OneDrive, all the way to your application creating a Teams channel. With the Graph API, you can build custom solutions which both leverage all of your customers' data directly from the source, as well as creating a personalized experience directly in the flow of your users' work. The Microsoft Graph is a single API that allows you to access data, traverse data between your application and the customer's Office 365 tenant, access insights and trends, and this works on both work, school accounts, so typical traditional Azure Active Directory accounts, but can also be used against Microsoft accounts as well. So once you're signed in as a user and authenticated, you can start to access data in Microsoft Graph. It's best to think of Microsoft Graph as an API gateway that unifies the many REST API offerings Microsoft has as a company. Today, Microsoft Graph brings together more than 25 important APIs, including Azure Active Directory, productivity APIs like Exchange, OneDrive, security and management APIs like Intune and Security Graph, and Windows APIs like Roam and CloudPrint, and many, many more. By leveraging the Microsoft Graph, you can build better apps with rich context for your applications, such as who is someone's manager, whether they are out of the office, or what documents they've been working on. You can access deep insights generated from usage patterns, such as trending documents, best team meetings, who are people typically working with. And you can respond to changes in the Microsoft Graph data in real time, reschedule a meeting based on responses, notify others when a file is modified, or continue to process after it's been approved. And this can be leveraged no matter what type of application you're building. Earlier we talked about security, which is key to ensuring your customer's IT is happy connecting to your app. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of features that can really help your app feel part of the customer's environment. First up is publisher verification, which is currently in public preview. When you register your application into Azure AD, you can now add your MPN ID so we can run some checks and then verify your application. This allows admins to allow end user consent to applications that have been publisher verified, increase customer trust and transparency for your application. So when they add your application and consent to it, they can see that the application is verified. And this is a key activity to start doing as we're moving towards a scenario where customers are going to start only allowing consent to verified applications. When it comes to identity, one of the common topics is always single source of the truth. This typically means if the identity data is stored in multiple places, which is the correct version, and how do they synchronize? In general, applications have their own users. This might be because they are built the app without an external identity provider, you're using local identities, or you need that user data for profiling, authorization, or licensing. Even if you are looking at changing your app to a customer's identity provider, like Azure AD, you no longer have to worry about managing usernames and passwords, but you still may need that user data. That brings us to automated provisioning. Typically, we see ISVs provisioning in a number of ways today. These could be CSV, manual scripts, custom automated solutions they've built, or on-prem solutions such as Microsoft Identity Manager. But nothing is standardized or scalable across applications. With Azure Active Directory, we support SCIM. SCIM is the system for cross-domain identity management and is an industry standard for automating the exchange of user identity information. Using SCIM, you can deploy a REST SCIM endpoint within your application that Azure Active Directory will send user and group data to in a JSON format. You can then do whatever you want with that data, for example, store them in a database. And as changes to the users in their source tenant change, your endpoint will receive those updates. By implementing automated provisioning, it becomes easier for your customers to onboard your application. They no longer need to collate data and send it to you. Your customer can then take and make changes to their users and know that those changes will be reflected in your application. As your app follows the customer's joiners, movers, leavers process, or JML, it reduces the risk of leavers still having access to your system. Inactive employees can automatically be deactivated from your application. Any profile updates like department changes are populated automatically in your application. You can also leverage security groups in the customer's environment to potentially help with role-based access. So there's benefits for both the customer and yourselves as an ISV. And if you build HR applications for your customers, we also support inbound provisioning, where your application becomes the source of the truth for Azure Active Directory. We've already got a good number of HR applications like Workday already integrated and providing these services. So the key thing with provisioning is you can provide both inbound and outbound depending on the use case for your application. Now, when it comes to integrating with Azure Active Directory, we provide a range of resources to help simplify implementation, whether that's single sign-on, provisioning, or utilizing the Microsoft Graph. So first off, we have the Microsoft Identity Platform. What we have here is one portal to register your applications, one set of Microsoft authentication libraries for building web, mobile and desktop applications with your favorite programming language. We have one endpoint that is standards compliant that sign in any Microsoft identity, which allows compatibility with third-party libraries. And we have secure access for APIs from the Microsoft Graph to Azure resources or your own protected APIs. And our platform supports open standards. So if you have any existing application based on industry standards, it's straightforward to connect your application. With our Microsoft Authentication libraries, often referred to as MSIL, we've made adding authentication into your apps easy. We provide documentation, reference code, samples and walkthroughs for a wide range of programming languages. So no matter what your application is built on, you should be able to get integration into Azure AD up and running quickly. When it comes to integrating with the Microsoft Graph, we have a great tool available called the Graph Explorer. Either using a pre-configured demo tenant or signing into your own Office 365 tenant, you can experiment with the Microsoft Graph Explorer and see the types of data, insights and actions you can get your application to integrate with in Office 365. And for outbound provisioning with Skim, again, we provide reference codes and a sample endpoint for you to test those onboarding and provisioning scenarios. So how can you get started? Well, we've got a number of resources available to you. You can find us on GitHub, Stack Overflow, User Voice, Twitter, and more. And as you can see, we have a number of useful links for the content, but of course, we're also open to have conversations. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to attend this session. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, my team, or your Microsoft One commercial partner representative. Again, thank you. I'll close off this session with a number of customer references for you to have a look at and see the types of applications and what their journey to integrating into Azure AD was like. Thank you.